Welcome everyone to our webinar today. We are talking about records management, the declaration of a record, and can you do this independently? Going to have some fun today. If records management is your jam, it will be very fun. So let me go ahead and kind of get us started. We will go into kind of what we're going to talk about today. So there's kind of a few sections of what we're going to talk about. We're going to first talk about what is a record, what does it consist of, how does that implementation work with Laserfiche, and what is a record more broadly. What records should you keep, and for how long should you keep those records? Then we'll talk a little bit about what is records management, more specifically, what is records management in Laserfiche. And then finally, we're going to talk about, go through a demo of records management using some auto filing and some what Laserfiche likes to call transparent records management, where things are driven based off of how documents are captured, things like filing dates and different options, doc types, and so forth, that tell you when a document is ready to start its life cycle, when the life cycle disposition happens, and so forth. And then finally, we're going to go over, 5 quick steps to implement a records management policy within your organization. So a couple of housekeeping tips as we get started. First things is the GoToWebinar control panel you're probably looking at. Everyone is muted. But if you do have questions, feel free to put them in the questions box, and we will get to those throughout the call. One of the people I have on with me is my coworker, Jeremy, and he is going to be keeping an eye on those questions as we go through this process. You can go ahead and put them there in the question box. The slides and screenshots, will be available upon request, so just shoot us an email. Shoot your account manager or me an email, and we can get those to you. And this is also being recorded. I am Jason Ramelsberg. I am the pre-sales manager here at CDI, and Jeremy Ruprecht is our implementation manager, who is on as also my technical backup today. In case there's a question that is super deep, he has got all the expertise to make sure we get those questions answered as well. So at the end, like I said, Jeremy will be watching the questions box and might just answer the questions there, or we can discuss them more broadly at the end of the webinar. But as we get started, let's kind of talk a little bit about, kind of what is records management and what is records retention more broadly. Records retention generally is going to be the practice by which organizations can maintain confidential records, business records, different things for a length of time, and then employ a system of actions to redirect, store, or dispose of those items. In response to some more data breaches, identity thefts, and various things going on across the world, it is increasingly more important that we handle all of that data with care, especially data that may have personal identification information, things that if it got out could harm the organization. But also there are things that are part of what you do on a daily basis that must be maintained. So for instance, the IRS requires that most tax records are kept for 7 years and then they can be destroyed. Well, what does that 7 years mean? Is it 7 years from when you file your taxes? What if you file the business taxes late? What if there's all kinds of different things that maintain that, and we're going to talk about how all that comes in to effect today. We want to have a structured approach to making sure these records are stored appropriately, and that when it's time for the records retention to happen, that it happens in an easy way, so your staff doesn't have to manage this on a day-to-day basis. One of the things we'll talk about today, if PowerPoint will click for me, is what happens when you take that systematic approach to records management, how it can benefit your organization. So for instance, you can make informed decision making, things such as when to destroy a record. If you know when the retention period started and that it's at its end of its retention period, it makes purging those records much easier. A lot of times I joke that when we have a digital records keeping system like Laserfiche, and it's not filling up filing cabinets in a room in your organization, that we oftentimes become digital hoarders. And part of records management is to make sure, A, that you're purging records as needed, but also that you have the records you're supposed to maintain for the right amount of time. The last thing you want to do is be required to produce a record because you have it, because you haven't purged it when you could have. And that's kind of part of what we're talking about. And a lot of that comes from government or industry regulations. Those government and industry regulations that you're going to see vary from industry to industry. The one I'm most familiar with is financial. So for instance, I've for the last 20 years worked mainly with financial organizations, banks, credit unions, and the like. Jeremy has worked very extensively with government. And so both of them have very different structures in how those retention items are maintained and what rules govern that information. You also want to protect your records from inappropriate access. Part of what records management does is as you go through this process, you can set your records into a more read-only state when they're in their retention period, so things are not being changed and they're being maintained as they should be. But you always need to be able to retrieve those documents when needed. So as we go through this, here's a few things, a few more things that will help. We talked about freeing up office storage space. If you're digitizing a lot of your records, that really does help. I had a customer many years ago who had so many documents that they were maintaining. Just getting them digitized was necessary, but getting them digitized also helped so that they could maintain their records retention lengths and put them into the right retention schedules. Part of the reason they were having issues was they had so many documents in one of their document rooms, so many file cabinets, it was actually causing structural issues in their building. Hundreds of bankers' boxes filled with different, mortgage and things like that documents. So digitizing is always a great way, but when you digitize, part of the problem that we run into, like I said earlier, is becoming those digital hoarders. And so you really want to make your system more efficient and make it easy to find what you're looking for. Part of this in the systematic approach is simply digitizing, which a lot of you do today. And part of this is going to be talking about how implementing a records strategy will really benefit your organization and help you purge things out as needed. So let's talk a little bit about what is a record. A record can be technically anything stored within Laserfiche, but according to the International Organization for Standardization, they say it's information created, received, and maintained as evidence and as an asset by an organization or person in pursuit of legal obligations or in the transaction of business. The two most common that you're going to run into are documents and email communication. Now, there may be others. There may be, under documents, you're going to have things like contracts and vendor agreements and all kinds of various items. But that's not just external items, that's also internal items, such as operational items like internal tax returns, board reports, minutes, city council information, whatever your organization is using. Those are the things that you're going to have that are standardized. Now, one of the things to remember is that The governance of that item, of those retention schedules, varies from organization to organization and even from industry to industry. There very well may be some things that you only keep using records management for a certain amount of time because that's your internal rule. But there are a lot of things that are governed by external governance organizations, such as, I have an entire document that Jeremy can share for the state of Washington, for instance, and it is hundreds of pages long of all of the various rules and regulations and what doc types have to be retained and for how long. And it's always important to check with your governing body. So for instance, in a credit union world, it may be NCUA. In the government world, it may be your state or federal regulators. Whoever that is your governing body, it's always important to check with them. And priorities may be different. As we go through this, you'll see that some people have a priority on just maintaining exactly what you have to maintain, but it really depends by organization what you're going to want to keep. You always have to keep the things that are mandated, but you may have other things that you create your own policies for. So for instance, you may have a policy for how long employee records are kept. Now, there may be some things you have to keep for 3 years past termination, but maybe you add everything into that 3 years, not just the things you have to maintain, because you want to keep a more holistic view of the item. Now, the question then begs itself, who makes these rules within your organization? Now, there's a couple of options. Oftentimes there is a records manager, and they may not be a full-time records manager. It may be the person who also manages Laserfiche for you, but it may also be a completely separate person who is kind of the judge and jury on what gets kept and for how long. There can also be a committee that represents various departments. So for instance, in a city, there may be folks that represent, the courts, folks that represent city council, folks that represent Parks and Rec, and all of them may have slightly different requirements for what documents get kept and for how long. Again, it is always important to check with your governing body on who sets those retention rules for what you need to keep. Now, like we've talked about, there's going to be industries or record types that don't have these clearly defined rules. In doing that, what we've put together are some questions to figure out if you have a record or not. So as we go through this, just kind of think to yourself, if these questions apply, how it would apply to you and how it would apply to your organization. First off, was it created in the course of business, correspondence, agreements, studies, things that may have to do with just the general work product of your organization. It may not have anything to do public facing. It may just be all internal documents. But again, those are things that may be considered a record. Was it received in response to an action? In the government area, was it a FOIA request? Was it some sort of controlled correspondence? Were you talking between organizations? Does it document organizational activities and actions? Minutes, project reports, personnel records, like their annual, personnel review, things of that nature. How does it document what happens within your organization? Is it mandated by statute or regulation? That is almost always going to be a record. It could be administrative records, lists of dockets. We always hear on the news that they often release the list of who visited the White House. Technically, that's a record. And how long does government say you have to keep those? And so there's little things that you may not think of as a record, but it really, again, focuses back on your governing body. Does it support financial obligations, contracts, grants, litigation files, things of that nature? And finally, Does it communicate organizational requirements? And this is one where it kind of can get a little bit fuzzy, because some organizations, there may be, you have to keep this policy or procedure for 7 years or 3 years or whatever the case may be, or you keep it until it's superseded by another one. And once it's superseded by another policy, then you have to maintain what that old policy was for X amount of time. And so those are things that as you're going through this, you kind of have to discuss amongst your organization with your records manager. And again, like I keep saying, your governance body on what needs to be kept and for how long. Again, the last thing we want to be is digital hoarders in this scenario. We want to make sure that we're keeping things for as long as we need to, but then destroying them when we don't need them anymore. All right. So how long do I keep my records? Again, this is really just another slide to say, as long as you're required to keep them, because it's different for different industries, right? Sometimes, like it says, there may be rules and regulations in place. Others are based on your own internal policies. Whichever it is, it's always important to set up those rules and to follow them accordingly. The set of rules you have should define a few things: how long it's kept and what happens to it when it's done with the retention schedule. There may be times when those documents are moved out of your control. For instance, in a governmental organization, it may be kept at the city or county level for a certain amount of time. And then there may be an entire document that says this is how you send them to the state archivist. And the state archivist may want it for, some documents maybe, well, send them to me and I'll decide if I want to keep them. And others are, send them to me and I have to keep them for so long. And others are, you can go ahead and destroy them. Now, as you identify these things, there are some benefits of having this clearly defined retention schedule. So you'll be able to have evidence of business activities. The last thing you want to do is say, oh yeah, I replied to that request. I replied to that FOIA request. And then maybe they didn't get it, or they don't believe they got it in the right amount of time, and a lawsuit is filed. And so in that scenario, what you run into is you need to make sure that you not only have the request, but proof that you replied to it. And so part of your communication with that and the documents that you're giving them, all of that goes with the identifiable evidence of business activities. The other thing is saving on office and server space. We talked about saving on office space for physical items. You may have your records manager may sit in a room full of filing cabinets that they want to get rid of. And in that kind of a scenario, you just simply want to make sure that your documents are digitized, backed up, and that they have they're organized in such a way that makes setting up your records management rules and finishing out the process easier. You also have the ability to preserve that information for historical and research purposes. Because it's now digitized, because it's now organized correctly, because your doc types and your retention schedules and everything are in place, it makes retention and the ability to know, oh, I keep this forever, this is a permanent record, I keep this for so long. It makes having that information accessible a lot easier for your historical and research purposes. Now, the practices of records management. So what you see on the right is a records life cycle, and that life cycle encompasses the following phases. We've got the creation of the document, the distribution, the active storage, the inactive storage, disposition, and archive. I'll kind of talk about this from two perspectives, both from the governmental perspective and from a financial perspective, from my background. Creation is when the document shows up in the system. And that may be something that's automatically captured. It may be something that is scanned in, later. But whatever it is, the creation time of that document oftentimes will start a life cycle of retention. Distribution, for instance, is it moving throughout the organization? Do we have to wait for that to happen? Active storage, this is when the document is an active document, it's being worked on. The retention schedule hasn't started yet. A good example of this may be a loan in a financial institution. As long as the loan is an active loan, it's not records yet. It's not in a retention schedule yet, because as you'll see later, there's different types of record schedules, and this one would be what's called a time and event, or an event-based, I'm sorry. And so once that loan is paid off, once that contract at a city with a vendor is executed, once that event happens, it can move from active to inactive storage and retention. At the end of the retention time frame, that's when you talk about disposition. So disposition is the part of a record's life cycle where you decide what's going to happen to that record. If at the end of disposition is destruction, meaning you simply delete it, great. Then you don't have an archive option. If the end of disposition is something in records management called a session. A session is merely the transfer of that record to another record governing body. For instance, from the city clerk to the county clerk, from the city or county clerk to the state archivist, whatever that may be. And so that's what you're going to run into here. Now, there is going to be some activities that go with this. Like I said, you've got the process of creating and approving and enforcing record policies, including a records classification system if necessary. Now, once you have that, you need to develop your storage plan, and that includes where documents are being stored, how they're being stored in Laserfiche. There's a lot of back-end stuff you can do, such as volumes, to make sure that your long-term storage items. There are things to think about when it comes to records management outside of just the record. If you have different types of storage in your Laserfiche infrastructure, you may have cheaper, what is often termed slower, cheaper storage, like that have cheap hard drives in them, and they're just like a SAN with very inexpensive storage for items that you're not going to access often. But you may also have items that are in more active storage, which is more, the storage you store them in is faster. And so that's another thing to think about when you're developing your record storage plan, both the long and short term housing those physical records as well as digital information. Because records management can also deal with the physical items. Maybe for a police department, that records retention isn't a record, maybe it's a box of evidence from a case, and you have to maintain that box of evidence for a certain amount of time. Laserfiche records management, as we'll talk about a little bit later, can even track those physical items and what location they're in. For instance, they're in the evidence locker in box A2263. And so that's something that can be done. As you finish going through creating your plan and developing your record storage plan, you then want to identify. You want to look at things that are existing and newly created records, and then how to store them. What are your operating procedures? What are the rules by which these items need to be stored and classified? Then you want to coordinate the access of those records within the organization. Part of the thing about records management that you'll see is that as it moves from this section over here on the left where it says active storage to inactive, maybe that also changes permissions to the documents. So for instance, the people that work on this stuff every day have access to do certain things when it's in active storage, but when it moves into the records retention and inactive storage, maybe that makes it read-only for everyone. So now you aren't messing with those items. And then you want to make sure and execute that retention policy you put together when it's done. The last thing you want to do is have a policy that you're not adhering to. A lot of times, especially in the financial world where there's gray area, you're only held to the policy by which you create. There are governmental and legal policies you're held to, but for things that aren't documents that aren't governed by that, you are held to your own internal policy. So if you have a records policy, you need to make sure that when the policy says to archive, when the policy says to delete, whatever your internal operational procedures are, that you maintain those, and that's very important. Now, let's talk about some definitions. What is an active record? These are some terms we're going to talk about. An active record is simply any record that is currently being used or accessed in the course of business. It is not something that has been moved to inactive storage. It's something that is something you're using on a regular basis. Whether that is simply because it is an active ordinance, an active loan document, an active different type of document for your organization, or is it, it's just active being used in your process, as opposed to the inactive record, which is being stored for legal and retention purposes, even if it's not currently in use. So that document may be something that you have to maintain forever, maybe like original articles of incorporation of the city or of the business or whatever the case may be. File date. This is the date the record or record folder was added to the system. This is important because oftentimes in some of the options you have with records management, the file date will drive how long something is maintained. It's part of a records rule. Cutoff is the time in a record's life cycle when it should become read-only and no longer modifiable. I call the cutoff the date the document is no longer live or a living, breathing document. I know that's a weird way to say it, but if it's a document that you can add sticky notes and somebody may need to go in and look at, and they may need to maybe add a page to it later, that's a document that's still in flux. That's a document that's still being used. Once we're ready to start the retention, the cutoff is what does that. The cutoff is when the document basically says, I am now starting my retention period. Think of it like document retirement, right? You're working your whole career and then all of a sudden you retire. You want disposition to be as far out as possible, but once you hit cutoff, you are retired as a document. The retention schedule is simply the rules that govern how long that document is maintained after it reaches cutoff. Disposition, we talked about this a little bit earlier. This is where we talked about, typically there's two dispositions. We've got destruction or accession. And again, like I said, that could be transferring a record from the city or county level to the state for long-term storage. Oftentimes in many organizations outside of government, the end of a retention schedule is just destruction. But if you do have the need, accession will track the date and time you actually moved that. The other nice thing about destruction is in your records retention rule, which we'll show when we show the rules here in a little bit, you do have the ability to maintain metadata. And so what that does is it gets rid of the pages or the PDFs or whatever the document was, but leaves the record listing in Laserfiche. And what this does is it'll show that you had the record at one point. It will keep the metadata of that record, the date it was created, the last date it was modified, when it was disposed of, and so forth. But you don't have to maintain the storage of that item. It's simply a line item record showing that you had it at one point and you disposed of it as appropriate, as opposed to just having it gone from your system. That's an option some people really like. Vital records. This is, I think, one of the cooler parts of the Laserfiche implementation of records management. What this does is it gives you the ability to have documents within your organization that need periodic review and update. This could be policies, this could be procedures, this could be insurance documents for the organization. This could be client insurance documents, things that you need to have reviewed on a regular basis. And that regular basis may be once a year, once every 2 years, every 6 months, whatever that is, or that can actually be driven by something on the document. So if the document has an expiration date, you can make it a vital record where when you input the document in the system, you put the expiration date in there, and that it's a vital record that needs to be reviewed now, that expiration date every so often. So if it expires every 2 years, then you review it every 2 years. And then finally, what about documents that are about to reach their life cycle and ready for destruction, but maybe you're in the middle of a lawsuit, maybe you're in the middle of a records request, maybe whatever the reason may be. Putting a hold on a document simply stops its life cycle management, puts a pause on it. And oftentimes this is done for things like a lawsuit, like I said. You may want to make sure and put that document on a hold so that, okay, well, in a month, we're probably not going to be done with the lawsuit, but we will have, this document will be up for destruction just because of the timing. Well, you want to make sure anytime you're doing that, that you place a hold on these documents. And what's nice is you can place essentially a perma hold, that's what I call it. It has no expiration date. Or you can place a hold on something for X amount of time, for 3 months or 6 months or a year. And it will simply pause that retention life cycle. Now, when I say pause, what it means is if during that time that record becomes available for disposition, it has reached its 7 years, let's say. It doesn't add the time to the retention of the record, it simply pauses its ability to be destroyed or to be dispositioned, sent to another organization or whatever. Now, the nice thing about that is once the hold is gone, the next time the records manager runs the report to see what's ready for disposition, that record will show up assuming it's met its life cycle. So it's a really nice way to have that set up. Now, let's talk about the Laserfiche implementation. We've been talking a little more generic. Let's talk about the Laserfiche records management implementation. It's going to have a few things. It's going to let you define your retention schedules, your cutoffs, your cycle definitions, locations, which is not used a ton, but it is a really nice feature to have, and your various holds. Let's talk about retention schedules. Like we said, it is merely a collection of rules, and those rules are going to define how these records are maintained. What you'll see here, for instance, down at the bottom, is you'll see you've got the name of the rule, you've got a description, how long you maintain it. If there's a file transfer, a disposition at the end, and do we retain the metadata, all those various things. Those are all things that are part of the retention schedule itself. Now, the retention schedule only happens once the cutoff happens. So the cutoff instructions are merely what causes that record to begin its records life cycle journey, if you will. Now, in this scenario, each cutoff will have various instructions on different ways of calculating the cutoff. So for instance, there may be something, I'll go with, again, things that I know really well, a receipt, a transaction receipt at a financial institution versus a loan document versus a closed account. All three of them have have different cutoff instructions. So a time cutoff instruction is basically from the time of creation, maintain it for X amount of time. So a receipt would be 7 years. An event plus time would be something where you'd run into like a loan where it is maintained for 7 years, but 7 years after something happens. So it's not 7 years from the date the document shows up in the system, it's 7 years from. So in an HR environment, that may be 7 years from date of termination, 3 years from date of termination, things like that. The event may be, oh, well, I only have to maintain this until something happens. And then intervals are very similar to date or to time, but they are maintained for X amount of months based on different things within your system. Superseded, if a document replaces another one, records management can say, oh, well, this was superseded by this new policy, this new procedure, and that can make it start a timer and begin its records retention rule, and then disposition action. You know, if something has a disposition action done to it, maybe there's another retention guideline after that. So those are your cutoff instructions and kind of how those work. Cycle definitions, these are going to be used in your time and event cutoffs. These are how often are you running these. So for instance, is this something that happens bi-monthly? Is this something that happens calendar half yearly or fiscal quarterly or every Monday to Friday? These are things that can all be determined that allow you to determine the vital record review schedules as well as time and event cutoffs. So that really does make this a nifty way to create your cycle definitions without having to build them individually into each record retention schedule. Now, the properties that are there, and we'll talk about these a little bit later, you can have a code for these. I think it's just a short abbreviation that makes it easier to see. You've also got the description and the type of cycle, and then periods that determine the cycle. The example I found that I thought was really apropos, a monthly cycle definition with one period set to December is a yearly cycle that says records would become eligible for cutoff and vital records would be due for review January 1. Now, what that really means when it comes to that review schedule is, let's say something happens and you don't get to reviewing them until February. Well, it still means that next year, because December is the date, that it would trigger it January 1 again. So it may not be, the first one took 13 months, the second one may take 11 months. Another monthly cycle definition with 6 periods creates a bi-monthly cycle where records become eligible for cutoff on the first day of the month following the end of the period. So for instance, what this does is it makes it so we were talking about if it was a yearly schedule and the receipts are 7 years, well, you're doing your disposition at the end of the definition. So some of the receipts will be almost 8 years old. So the ones from January, if you do them in December, are almost 8 years old. But the point is that you're maintaining your own records retention rule and you're following your own guideline. So for instance, some things may be kept a little bit longer because you don't want to manage records management every single day. So maybe you do it monthly, maybe you do it quarterly, maybe you do it annually. And that's all within your own options, as long as you're keeping them as long as you need to. When the actual disposition happens, really doesn't matter. That's something that's an internal policy or procedure. So here, locations are simply the physical locations where records will be transferred or accessioned to, assuming they're not destroyed. So for instance, if it's a paper record and it's a physical item and it's stored in the current file area, but then after 2 years, we move it to Iron Mountain storage, and then after 5 years, you give Iron Mountain the permission to destroy it. So those are some options there on how that works. And then finally, holds. Maybe you have like I was talking about, you can see down at the bottom, you can have a general hold that has no due date, just called legal action. What's nice is if you create custom holds, you can actually search for those in Laserfiche. So once the Smith bankruptcy is done, and maybe it was done before 1/31/23, maybe it's done in September of 22, you can remove the hold and those documents can then be destroyed. So now we're kind of to the end of the PowerPoint, yay. Let's talk about a little bit of going into our, let me hop out of this. Let me open my remote system and let's talk about the Laserfiche administration console and how this is set up. So when you're in your Laserfiche administration console, there is a section called records management. Within records management, you have cycle, location, retention, cutoff, and hold options. Let's start with cycle definitions, just to kind of walk through each of these. Again, we'll come back and we'll look at the calendar yearly. You can see that this is the one we talked about where it's a monthly option, but only happens in December. And so when you go into a retention schedule, and so we're going to hop out of this and go to retention schedules. You can see that in the retention schedule, if there is one in here that is time and event, let's see what we have. Oh, I'm sorry, cutoff instructions is where I need to be, my bad. So cutoff, you may have some cutoff instructions here that are end of calendar year. So you have to tell it what type it is. So it's a time-based cutoff, and it happens calendar yearly. And this is where those cycle definitions show up. Now, this simply is when a document is available to be cut off. So you put the document in the system, and there may be a few things you need to put in: the file date of the document, the maybe an event date. For instance, in an employee termination, you may want to put the termination date in there, and that would end up becoming a time and event option. And then this is where you would add the event of termination. And you could say it requires all of these events, or it requires any of these events. But this is simply defining how these documents are cut off to start their retention schedule. So for instance, if I wanted to create a new one, and let's just call it employee termination, I'm going to say this is an event-based, or it's time and event. So let's say time and event. I'm going to do this bi-monthly. Let's actually change this to quarterly. And I'm going to say my event is employee termination. Now, once the employee termination happens and it's met its cycle, then the document can be terminated, or can start its retention schedule. Now, once those dates are in, that's where the retention schedule itself comes in. So for instance, these may be a 3-year document. So the instruction says, how long do you want to keep the records in the file area? For 3 years. Laserfiche can track records when you move them from one location to another, such as a physical record into Laserfiche, a Laserfiche record into some other storage system. And then what is the option at the end? Am I destroying them? Am I accessioning them to another governing body, and so forth? Now, this is the checkbox I was talking about: retain metadata information in the repository. And that's always a really nice one to have, to maintain proof that you had the record at one point and that it has been destroyed. What it looks like in Laserfiche, once you destroy the record but maintain the metadata, is the record will have its normal record icon, but it will have a little circle with a line through it, and just showing. And if you double click to open it, it'll just have no pages. Excuse me. It'll have no pages, and it will be able to show that it has been destroyed, and that will be a date that's tracked as well. Now, the locations, this is the one we were talking about earlier, current file area. You may have other, current file area really just means Laserfiche, but you could also say it's in its current, filing cabinet, or wherever it normally resides. You can have different areas set up so that as it goes through these, the retention schedule shows where it needs to be transferred to, if it does. And finally, holds. Within the hold system, there's an open investigation in HR. You could create another one here just called legal hold. Let me open this one. Maybe I don't have rights to create a new one. Why is it not letting me create a new one? Either way, we could create a hold reason. You can also create them directly within the Laserfiche repository when you're placing a hold on a document. Now, these are the definitions that are set up. Now, the last thing a records manager wants to do is maintain all of this and manually apply this to folders and to files, and make sure things go through the proper items, but they're looking at it one at a time. That is not efficient at all. What we can do, and with some of our experts like Jeremy, we can create essentially a transparent records management option, which is using the power of Laserfiche workflow and workflow activities to, as documents come in, automatically apply filing dates and records retention schedules and cutoffs and so forth to them. So for instance, if I come into my incoming folder here, we're going to kind of do a quick demonstration. I'm going to delete these two folders here just so we don't have anything in there already. You can see there's no magic here. I'm simply going to do what happens. No smoke and mirrors. I'm simply going to create a new document here in Laserfiche, and I'm going to use my records management template. Now, my records management template could be parts of a different template that you use. There just could be dates on an ordinance template, or dates on an employee template, or a lending template, excuse me, whatever the case may be. But here, I'm simply going to put in today's date. I'm going to choose my department as administrative. I'm going to choose my doc type as city council, and my sub-doc type as oaths of office, or let's do city council, city meeting minutes. And then what's the meeting date? Let's say it was last week on the 7th. Okay. Now, once I do that, I'm simply going to hit OK. That new document will get created and it will disappear. Well, what happened to it? If I go back here to my demo folder, you'll see a new folder was created under administration. So it auto-filed where it needed to go. It put it under city council. It put it under city council minutes, the year, and then it named the document, whatever the name is that I put there, and then the date I put for the date of the meeting. That's a really nifty way to handle this, because what's going to happen is I just needed to know I put things in the incoming folder. They auto-filed. Well, the other part of this is to also apply the record properties. So if I come down here, because of the type of document it was and because of the date of the document, it was automatically, the cutoff instruction was passed, approved, or adopted. That was automatically applied to this meeting minutes. And this is something that has to be maintained permanently. In this case, it's listed as 100 years, but essentially it's a permanent record. Now, this is something that will never come up for destruction. However, there may be other things that have shorter retention schedules. So for instance, we'll come in and do one more. Let's go into another document. Again, we're going to use the records demo template. Today's date, let's do community development and communications. And there is no subtype for communications, so we'll just hit OK. And let's just call this sample communication. Now, again, this will disappear shortly. And once it disappears, it will create that new folder under administration. But now I'm in communications. My sample communication is here. And my record properties for this communication is the cutoff is at the end of the calendar year. Once the cutoff happens at the end of this calendar year, I will maintain this for 5 years and then destroy. And then it is also set right here to keep the metadata. So you have all of those options when it comes to putting these things within the system that give you the ability to have your documents automatically have their cutoffs applied, automatically have their retention schedules, so that when the time comes, the records manager can simply hit search up here at the top. Let's go to records management search, and let's look for anything with a certain retention schedule. Maybe I want to see the 3 years retention schedule. These are the items that have a 3-year retention schedule. I can look based on that. I can look based on things that are ready for cutoff. So they will be available for cutoff, and let's look for everything available for cutoff 1/1/2025. And here are the items, and the ones that we've done recently are in here. You've got the years, things that are available. Here's that sample communication we just did today, and that's available for cutoff on that date. Now, if I change this to 12/31/2024, you'll notice that I only have 36 items, and that sample communication is gone because the end of year cutoff would not have been met by that time. Now, that being said, where do you go from here? You go ahead and minimize this remote window, and let's go back to our PowerPoint. And let's talk about, 5 easy steps to implement our records management system. 1, make sure and identify the first step in doing this is identify any of the problems and issues and pain points that you may have within your organization, because you can't work on anything you don't know you need to work on. The second one is set goals. Once you've identified your organization's problems, pain points, and issues, set a goal for your staff and yourself. What do we want to do? Do we want to, let's look at certain types of documents. Let's look at getting our infrastructure, folder structure set up in such a way that it will make this easier. Let's look at building workflows and automations that will make this a lot smoother for us. And finally, make a plan. The first step in making the plan is finding a champion within your organization. Who's going to be the person that drives this? Who's going to be the person that pushes this? And you want to make sure you have the right people. Sometimes that's people within IT. IT may understand Laserfiche, they may understand the technical side of things, but you need to have people from departments that understand the documents and their relationships, and it's important for them to work together. Next step is to get to work. The best laid plans of mice and men do nothing if nothing happens, right? You may have the best plan in the world, but if you don't try to execute the plan, nothing will happen. You want to make sure and educate your employees, make sure these are in writing so that they have something to refer to. You also want to start creating that retention schedule in Laserfiche after you've created the retention schedule and what needs to be maintained within your organization more broadly. It's a lot easier to change it before you start building it in Laserfiche than after. Doesn't mean it can't happen. It's not difficult, but it does mean that you want to kind of look at what you're doing ahead of time. And then finally, whatever you do, stick to it. Don't, oh, we put this in place, but nobody does anything, so we're not going to enforce anything. You want to, that's the last thing you want to have happen, because if you don't enforce it, nothing will ever happen. It's a really sad commentary that, everybody knows what they're supposed to do, but it's easier to not do it, so we just don't. And then all of a sudden you end up with, subpoenas and work that would have taken minutes to do, but now it takes hours, days, weeks, or months. And so organization is key. Make sure that you organize all that content in this new framework to make it easy for you to maintain. Now, that's the end of where we're at today. Any questions? So if you have any questions, feel free to put those in the question answer box. This is something that's just an idea. This isn't, the end all be all of records management. It's way too broad of a topic, but hopefully this gave you some thoughts, some ways to think through some things, some new ideas possibly on how you might work with your Laserfiche system. Records management, there is the full records management module within Laserfiche. There are also ways to do it with what we call simplified records management. You can talk to your project manager or your account manager if you don't have the records management module to make sure and get that, because it does make life so much easier than trying to do it a more simplified route where you just create folders and dates and have workflow organize things for you. Because you do have, with records management, the module within Laserfiche, the full U.S. Department of Defense 5015.2 certified records management system. And there's that. Now, I don't see any questions. Let's see, there was one question. Yes, this webinar will be is being recorded, and I believe will be posted at some point. Check with your account manager or shoot me an email when you're done, and I can make sure and get you a copy of that. So if you do have more information, any questions, you've got this here at our website, cdi.support, or our YouTube channel, youtube.com/@CDI_official. And then finally, if you do need to get a hold of me, and you're welcome to screenshot this as well, that's my contact information, as well as how to reach our consulting group, our sales group, and our support group. So looks like we're just a little bit early. We're about 5 minutes early. Any last questions? Let's see, I have one more here. Yeah, just shoot me, if you do want a copy of the PowerPoint, just shoot me an email at that email address above, and I'll send you a copy of it as well. So I appreciate everyone for being on. Looks like I've answered both of the questions. If there are any others, feel free to shoot a question or an email to Jeremy or I, and we will be happy to get those to you. Other than that, I appreciate everyone for being on today. Thank you for joining us, and we will see you on the next one. Thanks, everyone.